This is a LSD trip report by John J., posted to aroid.org on August 7th, 2001. It has been 13 years since that fateful night, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that the experience still lingers like a faint afterglow on the horizon of my mind. I say this without any exaggeration. The trip did not merely alter a single evening, it rerouted the entire trajectory of my existence, and the after effects persisted for a good decade. I am not speaking of flashbacks. I have never experienced one, but rather of a prolonged sense of heightened awareness, a lingering highness that colored my perception of reality for years after the blotter had worn off. Only now, after much reflection, study, and countless conversations with teachers, therapists, and fellow seekers, do I possess a tentative understanding of what transpired that night and how it reshaped who I am. If that sounds somewhat psychotic, then so be it. The truth of the matter is that the mind does not always conform to comfortable narratives. I was 23 years old when I dropped the blotter. Prior to that moment, my relationship with mind-altering substances had been modest but steady. I smoked my fair share of marijuana, and at that stage of my life I was still very much unconscious in the Buddhist sense. I was not awake to the deeper currents that run beneath the surface of everyday experience. Cannabis would make me laugh, or at the very least grant me an intense aesthetic appreciation of my surroundings and whatever events were taking place. I had taken psilocybin mushrooms once or twice, and each time the experience left me with a sense of wonder that lingered for days. I had also experimented with a few microdots, the little purple and pink tablets that promise a short, sharp burst of euphoria. Those microdot sessions were the kind of trips where I laughed until tears streamed down my face, feeling as though I were riding the greatest groove of my life. In retrospect, I realized that those moments were safe because I was surrounded by people I liked and trusted, people whose presence created a secure container that allowed the psychedelic material to unfold in a positive direction. The blotter, however, was an entirely different beast. I have used LSD on several occasions since that night, but each subsequent experience has been tinged with fear. The last few times I have taken it, I have deliberately drunk heavily beforehand in an attempt to blunt the intensity. I am sad about that fact because I would love to feel that high again, yet I no longer feel the need to stand face to face with whatever divine presence one meets while on LSD. The memory of that first encounter is both beautiful and terrifying, and I am not yet ready to surrender myself to it without caution. The night began at the record store where I worked as a manager. It was a small, dimly lit space lined with vinyl sleeves and the faint smell of dust and old paper. I dropped the acid about an hour before closing time, feeling the familiar electric tingling that only LSD can produce. It is as if the central nervous system becomes a living wire, charged from head to toe, a sensation that is at once exhilarating and oddly comforting. I could feel a grin forming on my face even before I was fully aware of it. The store was quiet, with only a single customer lingering near the back, browsing the aisles. I answered his questions with a vague nod and a half smile, my mind already drifting on the currents of the trip. I was not particularly helpful, but I was shooting off hard, my thoughts racing ahead of the present moment. When the clock struck 9:30, I closed the store, turned the lights off, and began the tedious work of paperwork. The register journal stared back at me like a foreign language. The numbers blurred, the ink seemed to swim, and I could not bring myself to count or reconcile the totals. My body was still buzzing with the electric charge of the acid, and I felt an urge to move, to escape the static of the ledger. Suddenly, a loud, terrifying crash reverberated through the front windows, startling me so sharply that I leapt toward the glass as if a car were about to smash into the storefront. Instead of metal, I saw my friends, the very people who had brought the blotter to me that evening, standing in the doorway, laughing hysterically. Their laughter would have been funny under other circumstances, but the sudden shock planted a seed of paranoia that began to grow throughout the night, contaminating the trip even as it continued. We left the store together and headed toward our hometown, a 15-minute drive away. One of my friends, the girlfriend of one of the men in our little tripping party, was not using LSD, and I asked her to drive my old Pinto because I did not feel safe behind the wheel. She agreed without hesitation. As we pulled onto the road, rain began to fall in a steady, insistent drizzle. The car was at the end of its life, The windshield wipers were faulty, one of them working only half-heartedly, the other barely moving at all. I kept telling my friend that if she ever wanted to pull over, I would not blame her, that I understood the danger. She reassured me that she was fine, that she could cope because she was sober, but my perception of reality was already heavily distorted. The paranoia that had taken root in the store was now feeding on the rain, the faulty wipers, the sense that I had abandoned my responsibilities at work, and the knowledge that I was moving deeper into an unknown mental landscape. When we arrived at our destination, we stepped out into the cool, damp air. I was craving alcohol, believing that a drink would calm the frantic thoughts and bring a sense of grounding. No one had thought to purchase beer, however, and the only thing waiting for us was a small cabin that had been converted into a game room. The cabin belonged to a friend who was house-sitting for someone else. I did not know these people very well, and an uneasy feeling settled over me like a heavy blanket. Nevertheless, we entered, and I took a seat on the worn sofa, my eyes darting rapidly from one corner of the room to another, never staying on any object for more than a heartbeat. Without warning, a bright red light burst through a window, accompanied by the wail of a siren. The sound was blaring, the light was harsh, and my heart hammered in my chest. It turned out that the friends we were supposed to meet had arrived with a handheld device that simulated a fire engine, flashing the red light and sounding the siren for a prank. In my heightened state, the prank felt like an emergency, a signal that something was terribly wrong. I was sitting on the sofa, still under the influence of the acid, feeling uptight, paranoid, and uncomfortable. My gaze flitted across the room like a startled bird, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. One of my friends noticed my frantic eyes and made a teasing comment, and that was the moment when I finally announced, "I am having a really bad trip." Their faces turned to a mixture of disappointment, worry, and annoyance. I added, "I am not going to kill anyone or anything, but I am having a bad trip." I do not know why I felt compelled to say that. Perhaps I was responding to the concern etched on their faces. Perhaps I feared that they thought I was on the brink of a psychotic break. In truth, I was simply anxious and scared. I asked the friend's girlfriend, the one who had driven the Pinto, to step outside with me, and she obliged. The moment we left the cabin, the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. I felt an urgent need to walk, to move my legs, to let the city streets become a conduit for the restless energy inside me. My friends followed, though I sensed they did not truly want to accompany me on this nocturnal pilgrimage. I would not have minded being left alone, but their presence, however reluctant, was a small comfort. We walked through the rain-slicked streets, the neon signs reflecting off puddles, the distant hum of traffic a low-frequency drone that seemed to sync with the rhythm of my thoughts. As we walked, the acid continued to peel back layers of perception, and I began to see my companions in a new light. The veil that had covered their true selves seemed to lift, and I perceived them as wearing masks, masks of politeness, masks of humor, masks of camaraderie, that concealed a core of small-mindedness, of animalistic self-interest. I saw manipulation, shrewdness, and a subtle back-stabbing that had always been present, but was now illuminated by the drug's unforgiving honesty. It was a painful revelation, and I felt a deep sadness settle in my chest. I realized that these were not the people who would walk the path of genuine spiritual awakening. They were stuck in a loop of avoidance and denial. My relationship with them fractured in that instant because I could no longer pretend that they were the companions I had once thought them to be. This realization was, paradoxically, a form of enlightenment. It was my first kensho, my first glimpse of satori, the sudden, profound insight into the nature of self and reality. I understood that I wanted to strip away the pretenses, to live with as much authenticity as possible, to surround myself only with those who were willing to face their own shadows. The acid forced me to confront my own faults, the inappropriateness of my chosen path, and the truths I would have to pursue for the rest of my life. It was the end of a long delusion, the collapse of a comforting illusion. The remainder of the night unfolded with a mixture of sensory marvels and philosophical depth. I experienced synesthesia in vivid bursts. Sounds turned into colors, music became a cascade of shimmering ribbons that danced across my visual field. I cannot adequately describe the phenomenon, for language feels inadequate to capture the fusion of senses. The walls of my bedroom seemed to pulse with a slow, rhythmic throbbing, as if they were breathing in time with my heart. The blue dye from my rain-soaked jeans had bled down my legs, staining my socks, and I found myself fascinated by the way the pigment seeped into the fabric, the way the fibers swelled with moisture. I stripped down, sat on the floor, and studied my own body with a detached curiosity, watching the muscles contract and relax, marveling at the intricate choreography that allowed me to breathe, to move, to think. When my friends finally announced that they were tired of watching over me and decided to go home, I slipped back into the Pinto and drove the 20-minute stretch to my house. The drive was a study in extremes. I could either accelerate to an alarming speed, as if trying to outrun the thoughts that chased me, or I could crawl at a snail's pace, unable to settle into a moderate, steady rhythm. The wind howled through the open window, and I heard voices, distorted, demonic whispers, that seemed to rise from the ether whenever I turned the radio on. I imagined that if a police officer were to pull me over, I would be ready to confess that I was beyond any testable limit, that I was a walking chemical experiment, and I would welcome the arrest as a final release. Yet I made it home without incident. By the time I reached my front steps, the peak of the acid had begun to subside, though I remained very high. I sat on the porch, listening to the wind rustle through the trees and the distant whinny of horses across the street. The cool night air brushed my skin, and a sense of peace settled over me. I was away from the charlatans, away from the false masks, and I felt a quiet clarity that had been absent for years. The existential reflections that rose in this moment were centered on success and the cultural narrative of making it. I realized that it was acceptable for me to pursue happiness in whatever form it took, that I did not need to chase wealth, fame, or external validation. Simplicity, quietude, and authenticity could become my guiding principles. The weight that had pressed on my shoulders lifted, and everything seemed to glow with a gentle, benevolent light. Inside my bedroom, the throbbing walls continued their slow dance, and I felt a gentle euphoria wash over me. I lay down on the bed, the sheets cool against my skin, and let the thoughts drift like clouds across a night sky.